What are the common objects of our love? Those things that St. Augustine said bind a people into a nation. One thing, as we explore in the American Holidays series with JES Scholar in Residence Dr. Andrew Roth, is what people celebrate. And in this installment, we're taking a look at how Americans celebrate sports. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society Digital Programming. I'm Ben Spagan and I'm the Vice President at the JES. How has the meaning of the word sport changed? What has been the cultural evolution of those sports America loves to celebrate? From horse racing in colonial America to today's Triple Crown, from the rumble and tumble of 19th century fist fighting to mixed martial arts today, from Harry Wright's Cincinnati Red Stockings to today's MLB, from Princeton versus Rutgers to today's college football playoffs, well, you get the point, or at least we hope you will after this program. Answers to those questions, those looks at history then and now, what has changed? That is what we're going to seek to answer here with Dr. Roth as he continues his extension of The American Tapestry Project, exploring the common objects of our love and how Americans tell their story through the people, places, and things they celebrate. Now, you may recognize Dr. Roth from his book notes series published by the JES, or maybe his American Tapestry Project, both a radio program featured locally in Erie on WQLN Public Radio and nationally on the NPR One app, and a JES digital programming series. Now, in that programming series, in past episodes of this one, you might recall that I've introduced him and I've noted his accomplished career in academia, from lecturing to leading, as he's taught various courses before going on to serve in administrations in Erie and to lead Notre Dame College in Cleveland as its president before retiring and being named president emeritus. Breaking free from the tightening grip of retirement, Dr. Roth heeded the call to serve as the interim president at St. Bonaventure University. Now, seeing his vulnerability when it came to maintaining a relationship with retirement, we at the JES wrangled him in, where he has been serving as a scholar in residence, offering numerous lectures, producing plenty of publications, and facilitating the Ramey Fellowship Program. For a fuller and much-deserved bio, please head over to our website, jeserie.org. Folks, since this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're listening to or watching a later broadcast of this program, still send us your questions, your comments to keep this conversation going. And of course, for more information about upcoming JES programs and publications, do visit that website, jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the JES digital stage, Dr. Andrew Roth. Dr. Roth, thank you for joining us here.
I'm glad to be with you again, Ben. Happy to be with you, particularly with this experiment trying to add music. When we do these programs face-to-face, which hopefully we'll get back to eventually, it's hard to believe it's almost 2 years. We're closing in on 2 years, well, certainly over a year and a half. But in any event, I think we do probably need to get that background music just a tad lower. But I think I heard you, and I hope our listeners heard you clearly. As you said, this is the American Holidays. I don't know which episode. It is number 6. This is the 6th episode in our series on American Holidays, which of course is an outgrowth of the American Tapestry Project. And for those of our viewers in this instance, and listeners who are familiar with the general theory of the whole thing, we'll go through these first maybe 10 or 12 slides relatively quickly, but slowly enough that if we have any first-time viewers or listeners, they'll get some idea of how all of this fits together and why we're talking about sporting America. The question is, how many holidays do Americans celebrate? Well, as previous viewers will know, we have a rather astonishing number, 256. And that's not a scientifically derived number. I will confess I got that at that authoritative source, timeanddate.com, which is a calendar system, and they list 256 holidays, and I don't think that's exhaustive, but that's a big enough number. Excuse me there for that cough. But in any event, as we said, this is part of an ongoing series in which we try to look at major American holidays. And just very briefly to reprise, the series began back, I think we actually did it in February with Candlemas, Groundhogs, Chocolates, and presidents. We looked at a couple of episodes on freedom, Patriots Day and Juneteenth and Independence Day, then Memorial Day, Veterans Day. We looked at what we called commercial holidays. The most famous of a commercial holiday, by the way, if there's a first-time viewer, is a holiday that was invented explicitly to sell something. Now, that's probably a little bit of an overstatement because, as we learned in that episode, the history of Mother's Day is a little more complex. Anna Marie Jarvis invented Mother's Day to honor her mother, Anne Reeves Jarvis, and then sued the American Floral Association for commercializing it. And if you want to know more about that, you can find that episode on the Jefferson's Facebook page or at the Jefferson website. We looked at ethnic holidays. If I recall from that episode, we looked at the two big ethnic holidays, St. Patrick's Day and Columbus Day, which we just celebrated a couple of weeks ago, which has become somewhat contentious. There are people who think we ought to do it. And today we're looking at Sporting America. On November 18th, we'll be looking at Halloween and Thanksgiving. A preview of that can be found in today's book notes that just went out an hour or two ago. And we'll conclude this, I don't remember the exact day, but we'll conclude this in December with a brief history of Christmas. So that's the series. As I said, and as Ben said, the American Holiday Series is really an outgrowth of the American Tapestry Project, which began as a Jefferson Educational Society series. I think there were 5 episodes in that, and then we did that over at the Siegel Institute of Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, and I did that just this past August, at the Chautauqua Institution, and that has now turned into a radio program that airs on the second Sunday of every month at 4 p.m. on WQLN. But in some ways, with all due respect to radio, and more importantly, it is also on their podcast site and on NPR One, and you can find it. And so those two series on the American Tapestry were really about what's the American story. And they're an ongoing attempt to find out what Americans have in common and to see if we can somehow span or heal this cultural divide that is threatening our society. And as we looked at it, I thought, and as Ben knows, that the whole essence of the Tapestry Project and the American Holidays Project is that what really binds a society together are the stories that people tell each other about the society. And those stories embody their values. And as we have talked at some length on the Tapestry and earlier on the Holiday Series, humans are storytellers, as you can see by that little silhouette in the upper right-hand corner that Ben and I are kind of obscuring at the moment. I always get a little confused. I can see Ben on this thing, but I think the public only sees me at the moment. The speakers will switch in and out if Ben jumps back in. But in any event, there's a little silhouette in that upper right-hand corner because humans are storytellers. And as we explored at some length in the Tapestry program, they tell themselves stories to make sense of their experience, to actually quote Joan Didion. And the stories that endure, I avoid the value-laden word great or best or things like that, but just say the stories that endure, which turn out frequently to be the great stories, but that's another argument. We're not worried about aesthetics exactly at the moment. The stories that endure seem to share 3 things, or they do 3 things. They tell you where you came from, their origin stories, based upon where you came from and where you are now. They also have a moral or an ethical component. Sometimes they overtly preach and tell you how you ought to live. Other times they imply that this is how, as you just see the character and the actions unfold, those who survive behave in a certain way. And the indirect inference is that perhaps you ought to think about behaving in that way. And they give you some idea of where you're going. And so stories are really important as you build a culture. And as we have gone on at some length, and again, respecting the time of our ongoing viewers, but trying to bring up any new viewers up to speed on what we're doing here, is we ask ourselves 3 questions. What is the American story? What is the story Americans tell one another to bind themselves into a culture, into a people? And there is a question, is there an American story, or are there multiple American stories? And I think probably I should point out that my answer to that question is that's why I chose the metaphor tapestry. There are multiple American stories, but those multiple stories have certain core values in common with one another. Freedom, sometimes what we call freedom's fault lines, this notion of the American dream, although that phrase can be misleading because of certain connotations associated with it, but they'll call it the entrepreneurial, commercial spirit of America. And then what we call the immigrant's tale and the fusion thread, where all of that comes together. And so my argument would be that there is probably no one American story, but there are multiple American stories woven together around common themes, and that creates the American story. And the question becomes, why should there be an American story? Well, if there is no American story, if you have competing stories, then what happens is you retreat into tribes who compete with one another, either peacefully or perhaps not so peacefully, for dominance in a culture. It's just human nature. It's what happens, not unique to Americans. And I think one of the things that's happened in American culture in the last, if I could arbitrarily pick a date, Ben knows I'll pick 1968 as just a kind of arbitrary benchmark. Well, it's not arbitrary. There's a lot of reasons to pick 1968, but for the purposes of this discussion, it gives you a jumping off point. And I would say in those intervening 53 years, Americans have increasingly fragmented in the stories they're telling, or flip that comment around, have increasingly disagreed about their story. And that's because they're no longer speaking the same language, they're no longer reading from the same book, they're no longer telling each other the same story or stories. And that's important, because if we're no longer telling each other the same stories, well, people take their stories very seriously. And then you end up having people beginning to compete that my story is the one true story. A much bigger topic than we have even, actually it's a whole other series, but most religious wars in human history are really wars about whose story is the right story, whose origin story, whose ethics, whose ontological explanation, then tell you where we're going. That's, or really fights about whose story. So the thing that we're exploring in the American tapestry and in American holidays is what St. Augustine meant. President Biden happened to quote him slightly erroneously, but nonetheless, he quoted St. Augustine in his inaugural address that a nation is a multitude of rational beings united by the common objects of their love. So the question becomes, what are the common objects that Americans love? What are the things they love in common, despite their arguments about politics, about whether road X should go left or right, about what, well, not necessarily what should be taught in school. That's an argument about stories. But regardless of their policy differences, what are the things they hold in common? And as we've explored previously, looking at holidays is a way to ask the question, so in terms of what Americans hold in common and love in common, what does what we celebrate, why we celebrate it, and how we celebrate it tell us about the American story and who we are as Americans? And that's what we've been looking at in the American Tapestry. In this subset of the American Tapestry, the American Holiday Series, we've been looking at what do the holidays Americans celebrate and how they celebrate them tell you who Americans are as people. And what we're looking for is if we can understand what we celebrate, maybe by recognizing that what we celebrate in common will help us transcend the culture wars. So that's the whole point of this particular series. And the common objects of our love, as Ben and I have explored through this series, really come in my mind in two big buckets. One I call the profound, which is America's civil religion, and to kind of encapsulate that, America's civil religion is really its adherence to what is sometimes called the American Creed, and that is really the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When you add to that a belief in democratic, small d, government, and I didn't think I'd live long enough to see an argument about whether or not all Americans believed in democratic with a small d government, but we were actually watching that debate unfold in front of us if we're paying close attention. And then you add something about free markets and entrepreneurialism, all of those things together, the politics of democracy with a small d, the notion of an entrepreneurial culture, and the notion of a culture that believes in liberty and freedom, but mutual communal responsibility. That's the American civil religion. So that's the profound. But you also see it in the banal, pop culture. And I've been beginning to think as we do this series, Ben, that we could do another series on American history taught, not taught, let's strike that verb, but American history discussed or told through the lens of popular culture.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just because, as an access point, I feel like for so many folks, pop culture is the way to have these conversations, and I think we see that, apropos of today's topic of sports, of how we have political conversations of athletes choosing to stand or kneel during a national anthem. But then we also look in the past and we see that of athletes choosing to behave in certain ways at certain times, thinking of the Olympics, in particular, but then also thinking of Muhammad Ali in boxing, changing his name from Cassius Clay and to make a point. And that really serving as an entree point for a lot of people to have conversations about the profound, accessing it through the banal.
Absolutely. And pop culture here, perhaps for some people that word might be misleading. I mean popular culture, or the culture of the people. And in one of the book notes, I don't remember which one, I made the comment, if all you know about American music is what you hear at the Philharmonic, and I go to the Philharmonic, so if Philharmonic subscribers don't get upset, but if I'm saying if all you know about American music is what you hear at the Philharmonic, if all you know about American literature is Thomas Pynchon and David Foster Wallace and Toni Morrison, and we could go on with other examples, then you don't really know a lot about American culture, because American culture is popular culture. And that's a good lead into today's program, because we're going to take a look at sports, and I'm a sports fan of sorts. It's hard not to be in our culture, but not because sports in and of themselves are important, although they might be, but because of the lens, as a lens at which we can look at American society, and as a way of looking at American society, because I don't want to overstate the obvious, but it goes without saying in some ways that America is a sports, I won't say obsessed, that has certain negative connotations, but it's a sports saturated culture. One could even argue it's sports centric culture. And that is perhaps a new phenomenon in the world. That's an assertion I'd have to think a little bit about, but it is not a particularly ancient one. It is really a phenomena of it's really a phenomena of the Industrial Revolution and of the 19th and 20th century. Well, sure, certainly there were games before, but never on the scale and the level of organization that you see in the 21st century world, not just America, and the 20th century world. So anyways, today we're going to look at all of these things, and one of the common objects of our love that we're going to focus on today is sporting community. And we're going to take a look at the days in the American sporting calendar that are the American holidays. And that is going to get a little tricky, and we'll come back to that. If we were to look at those days or weeks or events, maybe is a better word than days, that actually almost rise to the level of holidays, when people set things aside and just focus on them. You have things like the Monday night when the Final Four ends, or the bowl season. It used to really focus on New Year's Day in a way that has actually been fragmented and somewhat lost and scattered. And I doubt highly that anyone except a real serious college football fan can tell me on what date next year. This year, it's actually next year because it'll happen in January, but what date the 2021 national championship game will be played. But a racing fan, I know our colleague Pat Punio could tell us that the Kentucky Derby is always the first Saturday in May. And the Masters is frequently the second Sunday in April, but that kind of moves around and it frequently overlaps with Easter, interestingly enough. I'm sure only the most, if John Melody happens by some remote chance to be watching this at some point in time, he could probably tell you the date of the MLS Cup and the Stanley Cup, etc. And of course, the Indianapolis 500, once upon a time, I could have told you that was May 30th, Memorial Day, but now that Memorial Day moves around, it also moves around. I think is now held on a Sunday for television. But there are three holidays or three sports events that do approach holiday status. Two of them, one is the Kentucky Derby, and there are Derby parties. I'm sure all the people, I would be really willing to make the statement that everyone watching this, everyone, 100% of the people watching this, and who will watch it over time as it's posted on Facebook and on the Jefferson website and on YouTube, have gone to a Derby party at least once in their life. The World Series is a little more amorphous, and it may turn out, if we wanted to talk about sports marketing, to be one of the problems the World Series has. We can't guarantee you when the seventh, forget the seventh, we can't guarantee you when the deciding game of the World Series will be played. It could be the fourth, fifth, sixth, or seventh game of any given series. We know, as I just said, the Kentucky Derby is the first Saturday in May. But we also know that one other event has swamped both of these and has come to dominate the American sports calendar. And that, of course, is the Super Bowl, which is gone later and later. It actually used to be in early January. Then for a while, it was the first Sunday in February. But I think this year, with the expansion of their schedule, it's now, I think, maybe the second Sunday in February. But the point being, there is one date and everybody will know it. So those are the 3 days that turn out to be holidays as we've been discussing them in this series. But before we take a look at those, I think we have to ask ourselves, why sports in America? Why are we talking about sports in America? And I touched on it ever so briefly a moment or two ago. It's because Americans are not a sports obsessed society, but it is a sports saturated society. One kind of arcane piece of evidence is the National Retail Federation's list of the top 10 holiday spending things. The Super Bowl comes in at number 7, fast catching up with Halloween, although as we will hear in next month, and when we look at Halloween and Thanksgiving, even though it'll be afterwards, Halloween is starting to inch up on this and threaten Valentine's Day as Halloween is becoming a bigger and bigger holiday. But all of that notwithstanding, the Super Bowl is still the 7th in terms of consumer spending or consumer spending per capita, the 7th largest holiday. I suspect most of that's on beer and food for Super Bowl parties. I don't know that anybody buy Super Bowl. Well, there are Super Bowl decorations, but they're actually, relatively speaking, small change. Ben?
And I might add too, one of the things, Dr. Roth, I've seen tick up over the years is, and we've talked about this in other series, the commercial impact on holidays, and not just the food, not just the beer, not just the accoutrements that come along with the party, but the thing we watch it on, the electric hearth, the TV sales tick up right around Super Bowl. We see now advertisements for get your biggest screen TV and get ready for these parties. And so now we see again the imprint of commercialism on holidays and driving this of, get the beer that is being advertised, the soda that is being advertised, and watch those advertisements on your brand new television. TV sales now up immediately right around Super Bowl season.
And that's a perfect lead into the next slide, because if the Super Bowl's number 7 on holiday spending, sports, and in this particular instance, football, dominates television. The top 10 TV shows of 2020. Now, when we say top 10 here, I just got immediately, we're not saying these are the 10 best shows. This is not an aesthetic judgment. This is just the highest rated, greatest viewership of the 10. 8 are football games, and of those 8, 7 are professional football games. And the highest rated television show of 2020 was the Super Bowl. The national championship college game shows in here at number 7. The only 2 non-sports programs to crack the top 10 were the Oscars, which people have been trying to write the Oscars off. But of all the award shows, that could be a a subset holiday program. Television award shows have, kind of metastasized. I'm old enough to remember that once upon a time, the only television, or it wasn't even a television show originally, the only award show was the Oscars. But now they're everywhere, just about any genre. Ben?
And I think the interesting thing here, if we're talking about threads to weave this together, is that maybe there could be some hair splitting over thread splitting over the Oscars, because we're awarding something for a non-reality or fiction. However, the show itself is reality TV. All of the shows on this list, in some way or another, are reality TV based. We're watching humans in real time do real things. I just find that fascinating that, not and I might be dating myself with the reference, but not a Seinfeld, thinking about the importance of watching the final episode of that series, or watching
You'll
the
see
final.
Something like that comes up on the next slide, but that's a really important point. I hadn't thought of that. They all are reality TV. And I think and I don't get into it, I don't have a slide on it, but this is as good a place as any. That's a great point. Thank you, Ben, for bringing it up. I think part of the appeal of sports on television is it's the last authentic drama. You don't know how this is going to end. Most television programs, now this has changed in the last 5, 10, 15 years, where there's more ambiguity in the outcome, and sometimes the bad guy wins. But that, once upon a time, not so long ago, 20, 30 years ago, never happened. They always ended up with happy endings. And of course, for half the people watching the 49ers and the Chiefs, the ending wasn't happy. Oh, sorry.
And I think too, one of the interesting points is so I'll admit here, I don't watch shows like The Masked Singer, and I might be out of the know on betting, but when it comes to the Oscars, but one has to think too that the increase of the ability to now bet digitally, with all of these different apps on sporting events, could also be tracking that up, and that we're following this in real time, where people are putting real money on the line on an outcome and then watching it. Especially when you think about things like fantasy football. I know that doesn't exist in in college sports yet, or it might not. But people can still bet on the outcomes of those games. And so we have sometimes literal skin in the game, not literal skin, but we have skin in the game in that we're actually betting on these and then watching for the outcomes. And like you said, Dr. Roth, whoever's tuning in, half of the crowd is going to be disappointed. And what's interesting too is not everyone in the country is going to be a Kansas City fan or a San Francisco fan, yet we tune in to watch anyway, or we might bet on that game anyway, driving our participation in this thing to watch these events in real time, despite the fact that this might be the first game that somebody watched all season featuring either Kansas City or San Francisco.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And betting, and I'm sure this is why I'm not sure, I don't know for a fact, I hardly was privy to their decision making, but the reason baseball, basketball, and football finally gave in to, finally relented, is it wasn't because they necessarily changed their opinion, but they just saw exactly what Ben said. If you're neither a Chief nor 49er fan, you can bet on the over/under, office pools, et cetera, and suddenly we will see these numbers over here of viewers, which by the way are in the millions. We'll see those numbers go north in the next couple of years. This slide is the top 10 TV shows of all time. And again, this is not an aesthetic statement, it's just the highest rated shows. And you'll notice that 9 of the 10 are Super Bowls, which is the power of that one date. The only non-Super Bowl show to make the top 10 was the final episode of MASH. And others around are like that, but that's it. The top sports of our time. I mean, this really isn't about football, but it struck me when I was looking at this data. And I like football. I like I mean, I like most of the sports, but I'm more of a baseball fan. And if we look at participants, basketball and baseball by almost a factor of 2.7, almost by 3, have 2 to 3 more times people who participate than actually play football. But if we look at television viewership, that ship has sailed. Football is America's game. You know, it averages 38% of all TV sets are turned on to a football game at some point in time. Basketball is second, which is to baseball's chagrin. I'm looking at this chart, and this is from Variety, the television, the show business magazine. Basketball has a smaller average viewer. Baseball has a higher average viewer, but they have percentages. So those two are, you know, in contention. But football's far and away. Soccer is moving up. People, this is a generational thing. A lot of folks of my vintage are probably surprised by this. And a lot of folks of my vintage 30, 40 years ago told you soccer was going to take over. Well, that didn't happen, but it took a lot longer than people thought, but it's starting to move in because you just have, well, 13.6 million Americans. More kids play soccer than play football. More participants in soccer than football. So whatever. In any event, why sports? Well, sports because from a commercial, from an entertainment perspective, it's inarguable the impact. But sports also, you know, are not neutral. They have values, and you know, sports have positive values for society. And this is true for men and women. Everything about sports that's true for men is true for women, including the good, the bad, and the ugly. On the good level, perseverance and hard work. They teach you teamwork and how to collaborate. You would hope they teach you respect and courtesy, maybe not all the time. It develops some courage to go out and compete. One of the things it teaches is how to take intelligent risks. It teaches humility. One of the things you learn from playing sports is you learn how to lose, which might sound stupid, but you know, it's the old bromide. If you fall down, that's not important. It's what you do next. Do you get back up and continue? And sports teaches you that. It teaches you a little bit of humility because you don't always, there's very, very, very few people. We can name them on one hand of the people who never encountered someone better than them. And even Michael Jordan and even Babe Ruth, to use an old example, as Charles Barkley said, Father Time is undefeated. You know,
we might joke about somebody today with, you know, Tom Brady maybe being the only exception with Father Time of still playing. But if you look at the win-loss column, even Brady has suffered a loss with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this year. So, you know, and there's only been, and, you know, the champagne is bought every year for the Miami Dolphins to then, you know, pop the cork. But even the players on those teams were never undefeated their entire careers. And so at some point you encounter loss.
All the time. Somebody wins much of the, some rare people have won much of the time, but no one wins all the time. And I love that Charles Barkley line, Father Time is undefeated. So those are all the positive things for individuals. There are positive things for communities. I would always have this discussion with faculty members, and I understand, perhaps even more than some faculty members understand, because in various roles I had over the years, I was privy to budgets and I was privy to some other information. So sports is not pure, but nothing creates community or institutional or organizational school pride faster than sports. I like to tell you it's the debate team. I was on a debate team. I'd like to tell you it's the choir. I was not in the choir. I would like to tell you, but it's not. It's sports. I have up here, you know, the skylines of Pittsburgh and Cleveland. And I was at a Cleveland, at a City Club meeting in Cleveland one time. And for some reason, I was sitting at the head table with the editor of the Plain Dealer. Susan was her first name, and I'm having a brain cramp. I don't remember her last name. But she was the editor of the Plain Dealer, and she had brought along with her Stephen Litt, who was the architecture editor. And I can't remember why we were at the head table, because I can't remember the speaker. But Stephen Litt asked me at that time, when the Browns were at one of their low, and in the last 30 years, there's been frequently low spots. And I'm a Browns fan, so no nasty letters. And he asked me, why are Pittsburghers so proud of their city as compared to the way Clevelanders act? And I told him it's because the Steelers, the Penguins, and once upon a time, the Pirates won. And he looked at me, he said, are you saying if the Browns won, it would, I said, if Cleveland spirits would rise? I said, absolutely. If the Browns were big time winners like the Steelers have been, now the Browns were once upon a time, we'll talk briefly about that. But I said, absolutely. Well, Stephen Litt didn't really agree with me, but I stand by that statement, that I think part of the reason Clevelanders of a certain generation for a while had a kind of down in the mouth attitude is that for a while, prior to the 90s, there was like a 30 or 40 year period when the team formerly known as the Cleveland Indians were lost in the desert. Then in the 90s and for the last 30 years, they've been very competitive. And there was a time when they and the Browns were dreadful. And that just demoralized the town. As Ben mentioned, I had the honor to help St. Bonaventure through a transition. And St. Bonaventure is a tremendous university. They number 5 or 6, I think it's 6 of their alumni are Pulitzer Prize winners. They have an outstanding communications department, a fabulous business department. I'm not going to give you a commercial for St. Bonaventure, but the reason I suspect if there is somebody watching this on Facebook who is living in Oregon, the chances are they've heard that name. And with all due respect, I'm an alum and former faculty member at Gannon. I spent many, many years at Mercyhurst, and I was the president of a Catholic college in Cleveland, and I'm an alum of John Carroll University. But the reason that person in Oregon knows St. Bonaventure, somewhere in the back, there's some little synapse aspiring. They've heard that name. They're on the other side. It's basketball. And that's the only and Gonzaga is a Jesuit university, and I'm a graduate of a Jesuit university. It's a fine institution. I know that. You don't even have to sell me on that. But the reason you in Erie, Pennsylvania know about Gonzaga isn't the fact that they have an outstanding history department or a great business program or a great music program. It's because of their basketball team. So, school, community, and national pride. Sports can reinforce or challenge cultural values. I have Jackie Robinson here and Jack Johnson. I was having a conversation at lunch. I have lunch with a group of fellows on Friday. I call them the curmudgeons, but we were talking about, I don't know, it came up once, and I made the comment that I thought that you could make the argument that the two most impactful African Americans are the two most impactful men in African American history. I'm not saying the greatest, because there's a long list of people that would qualify for that, are Jackie Robinson and Jack Johnson. Because we'll see in a moment when we get to it in the history of boxing, brief look at the history of boxing, when Jack Johnson defeated Jim Jeffries around the turn of the 20th century, for all white supremacists in the country, that was an existential moment. A black man showed that in a fair fight, he could beat a white guy. And when Jackie Robinson, and I should have put a picture of Larry Doby up here. I have him on the baseball slide, because Jackie Robinson was April of 47 and Larry Doby was July of 47, integrated the American League. What Jackie Robinson showed that he could play Major League Baseball better than 9 out of 10 other guys who happened at that time happened to be white. That changed things. That just changed things. We're still dealing with the repercussions of all of that, but that changed things. And that was sports, because sports is so central. And of course, the economic impact. That's our own UPMC Park and Erie Insurance Arena. And those two things have breathed life into downtown Erie that absent them wouldn't be there at different times of the years. I mean, it's a little more, but there is. So if there is a viewer watching this, I'm not Pollyanna. I'm not saying that this is all pure. There is an underside to sports in America. It can sometimes bring out the worst in players and fans. Some people have argued it's the American religion. Again, I had an interesting conversation with some folks. Actually, it was Bishop Dwayne Brock who brought this up, mentioned this at a lunch we were discussing. And then John Downey, another friend of mine, the retired dean of the Episcopal Cathedral of St. Paul, mentioned to me that on Sunday, I think it was Bishop Brock was driving down State Street on his way to church, and he noticed that the stadium was packed with youth sports. And John mentioned that on one Sunday, not so long ago, the Gannon Hammermill Center was packed with a youth sports event, but the church pews are empty. And so we see that just struck me. And as I said at the time, that the two of them, that's kind of like an aha moment to me. I have to process this a little more, but that is some kind of major shift that parents are taking kids to sporting events that are not events, these are participatory events that are packed, but the churches are empty. But we all know about, well, decades of abuse, athletes being sexually abused, over here, steroids. We know the danger to brain damage. We know about gambling. Back over here, there's a Larry Nassar. Frequently, in the underside of sports, you'll see commentaries about toxic masculinity. It brings out the worst because it's high. It's by its very nature, it's competitive, and to the extent that competitive can go overboard, it's a negative. And it's usually a picture of male coaches going out of control. But I thought, just in the interest of gender equity, this is Georgia Tech's former coach, Michelle Joseph, who was fired for emotionally, mentally, and verbally abusing her players. And so there's an underside. So there's no pretense in this program to say that sports is pure, but it's a big deal in America, and it's an American almost holiday and celebration. So let's take a real quick look at a brief history of sports in America in the colonial era. Of course, lacrosse was Native Americans. The earliest sports were, kind of they were violent sports, bear baiting and cockfighting, which eventually were declared illegal. There was also a kind of crude forerunner of football, which was like a kind of amalgam of football and soccer and rugby, where one town would try to kick a pig's bladder, an inflated pig's bladder, across the boundaries of the neighboring community, and the other guys from the other town would try to stop them. But the most important, the largest sports in colonial America was horse racing. It tended to be focused in the South. Ultimately culminates in the 1850s with the founding of the 1870s, the founding of the Kentucky Derby. But there's also an interesting sociological thing. Horse racing tended to be something the aristocratic and elite did, because only they could afford a horse who had no other function than to run. And I'm not an expert on this by any stretch, but thoroughbred horses have powerful hindquarters to drive them forward and rather fragile forelegs. And when a horse breaks down, it's the fragile forelegs that break. And there's really, that horse isn't going to pull a wagon. But so what happened is that the more modest farmer gave rise to sulky racing. It started out as wagon or cart racing. Eventually the wagon got refined into a sulky, but that's the origin of trotters. It was, I don't want to use the word low class. It was the common man's response to the aristocratic thoroughbred racing. In the 19th century, foot racing, race walking was big, an early version of jogging. I mean, sprinting was big, and then rowing, Thomas Eakins sculling on the Charles. But of course, the big breakthrough, sailing, was an aristocratic sport. This is John Cox Stevens being congratulated by Queen Victoria for winning and this is John Cox Stevens, for winning the America's Cup in 1851, when the Americans took it back to the Brits. And of course, there was, on a much less elegant level, there was bare knuckle fighting. And this is actually the actual real John L. Sullivan in the bare knuckle days of the 1890s. So those were the big sports. As the century wore on, you had baseball. Baseball emerges. Abner Doubleday didn't invent it. Actually, no one invented it. It kind of grew out of just town ball and kids playing it. It finally got codified, not in some bucolic setting, interestingly enough, but in New York, when this group of fellows founded the original New York Knickerbockers, which was a private baseball club. And if you can see my cursor, this fellow in the middle of the top row, that is Alexander Cartwright, who, if anyone can be said to have invented American baseball, it's Alexander Cartwright who wrote the rules, who essentially then codified the rules and created the first league. Baseball's popularity really grew in the 19th century, both in the Confederate and Union troops playing baseball. This is actually Union troops playing baseball at the Salisbury, North Carolina prisoner of war camp. Then, of course, in 1869, the first truly professional, all professional team, the Cincinnati Red Stockings. In 1876, the National League begins. As I mentioned, football has its birth in the 19th century. The first college football game was probably really a rugby game, or some combination of rugby and soccer, when Rutgers played the College of New Jersey, which is what Princeton was called then, not the current College of New Jersey. And football was an extremely violent game. This is a depiction of the flying wedge and a lot of injuries in Yale, Harvard. And of course, we mentioned that's John L. Sullivan and Gentleman Jim Corbett, bare knuckle boxing, Jack Johnson again, and this is when Johnson defeated Jeffries, and in many ways turned the world upside down and created the Great White Hope phenomena. Most of the sports at that time had nothing to do with schools. They were town clubs, and the towns would have clubs. This is a town club teeny, another town club. It was sponsored by the town. These are the Minerva Merchants. All of this started in the 19th century, but by the middle of the 20th century ran out of steam because something happened. The high school movement of the late 19th, early 20th century dragged sports into the schools. Even in Erie, this is an architect's rendering of what Academy Stadium, it's now called Veterans Stadium, Academy Stadium was to originally look like. We would have to ask some viewers, and I doubt if anyone's around who remembers when it actually looked like that. And that rivalry, you know, the dominant, in those days, it would have been Academy High School versus East High School. I didn't grow up in Erie, but I've heard about that being the great wars of the time. And nowadays it's Prep versus McDowell. But where I did grow up is, in fact, the most famous high school rivalry in the country, sometimes called the War of 1894. I went to Canton McKinley, and it's painful to admit, I hate that little emblem of the Massillon Tiger, but it's painful to admit that over the 132-year history of that rivalry, Massillon has got the upper hand. I think they've won 74 to McKinley's 53, and whatever the difference is are ties. So that sports, then the clubs, and you see that to today, they're local clubs. What's interesting, and we don't have time to get into it, what you see with this club sport thing is a kind of return to that with soccer, and to a lesser extent, hockey. But basically, it was taken over by the high schools. Boxing was the dominant sport at the turn of the century. Here again is Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries. That is Jim Jeffries. That's the famous fight. Johnson was succeeded, but boxing was a way for immigrants to fight, literally in this instance, fight their way into society. That's Jack Dempsey. This is the famous Dempsey-Tunney fight, the long count, where the ref gave Tunney more time than people thought was necessary. Max Baer was a Jewish immigrant who was a great fighter. Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, of course, was, again, socially significant because he was the heavyweight champion of the middle 30s. Some of the viewers, some of our Jeffersonians will remember the Friday night fights, the Gillette Cavalcade of Sports. Probably the greatest boxer of that era was Sugar Ray Robinson. Rocky Marciano is obscured, another example of in this case, Italian immigrants. But boxing took a blow, no pun intended, when Emile Griffith killed Betty Kid Perrette in the ring. Actually, Perrette died 5 days later of brain trauma in a hospital, but he was taken to the hospital from the fight, from the ring, and never recovered and died. And actually, you can say that began the decline of boxing, even though Muhammad Ali restored it for a while. Boxing has been pretty much eclipsed we now see the revival of it with mixed martial arts and things like that, that has less in common with boxing and much more in common with what used to be called the rough and tumble of bare knuckle fighting. Baseball dominated the 20th century. As I look at the clock, we don't really have time to go over the whole history of baseball, but I do kind of have it here on one slide, from the founding of the National League in 1876, the American League in 1901, the Black Sox of 1919. There's Larry Doby, finally give him his due as we come all the way down to the present. But baseball was dominated in the 20th century by the New York Yankees. There's really no way around it. But what's really important about it is another possible offshoot of this whole series would be to do one on celebrity and the history of celebrities, because Babe Ruth is, it's hard to, you want to talk about how great an athlete he was. This is a person whose heyday was 100 years ago. And something that is allegedly not as central to American life as, say, whatever else you want to pick, but you still talk about Babe Ruth. He was a great player, and it's for another context and people to argue about whether or not he was the greatest player of all time. He's certainly on the short list of whoever was the greatest player. He's one of them. But more importantly, he was the first genuine coast-to-coast continental American celebrity. And that was driven by radio and movies. More importantly, newsreels. Yeah, and he is the first person who exploited that media to become a personality bigger than the sport that he played. College football dominated the 20th century, from Red Grange, the Galloping Ghost, the Four Horsemen of Notre Dame, and Newt Rockne, all the way down to the Heisman Trophy, et cetera, et cetera. There's two things I'd like to point out. One of the threads in the American tapestry is Freedom's Fault Lines, the Times Tales of Race and Gender. And this is from the Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina ABC affiliate. They did a program on the greatest college football players of all time. And what I found interesting about that picture is, and you can name it, we have three African, that's got to be Bo Jackson in an Auburn uniform. I assume this is Herschel Walker, who's now running for Senate in Georgia, and Jim Brown. But this also happens to be Jim Thorpe, who played college football for the Carlisle Indians. And one of the most famous football games, college football games of all time, and I think it was 1915, is when the Walter Camp's Carlisle Indians team played West Point, the Army. And Carlisle Indian School, it was a school where Indian males, Native American, indigenous people, were brought to Carlisle, Pennsylvania to try to turn them into, well, for lack of a better word, white middle-class Protestants. It didn't work. But one thing that happened is they played Army in a football game and the Indians won. This black and white photo over here, which ought to be interesting to Western Pennsylvanians, this was from the 1922 Rose Bowl, when Washington and Jefferson College ended the University of California's 18-game winning streak in a 0-0 tie. It's been a long, I think you could probably win a bar bet on asking anyone, did W&J ever play in the Rose Bowl? The answer to the question is yes. And they didn't lose. They didn't win, but they didn't lose. They tied 0-0, the defending national champions. A comment I made to Ben before we started this was, I'm surprised. I should have known this. I grew up in Canton and I've lived in Erie for a long time, 50 years. A surprising number of major sporting, historically significant events occurred in Western Pennsylvania and Eastern Ohio. The National Football League was founded in Ralph Hayes, that's Ralph Hayes, his auto dealership. That was his auto dealership at 2nd Street Southeast, actually Southwest, excuse me, in Canton, Ohio. And Jim Thorpe played for the Canton Bulldogs. And that's when the National Football League began. And that's why the Professional Football Hall of Fame is in Canton. It's because of Ralph Hayes. Also, before baseball, before Jackie Robinson, in 1946, Paul Brown, probably the most famous of professional football coaches, him or Vince Lombardi, and it again pains me to point out, he was the coach who made the Massillon Tigers famous, but he also integrated professional football by signing Bill Willis and Marion Motley, who, by the way, is the greatest player that ever went to Canton McKinley High School. So that war of 1894, two of the greatest people associated with it are major figures also in the history of professional football. In any event, professional football was a minor league sport until December 28th, 1958, when the power of television, the New York Giants and the Baltimore Colts played for the NFL. It wasn't called the Super Bowl yet. Played for the NFL championship on TV. It was in black and white. And the Colts defeated the Giants in overtime to the largest audience any television program had ever drawn. And the audience grew all afternoon as the game wore on, and people would call and tell other people, you got to watch this. It's called the greatest game ever played. And that created the modern NFL, which of course absorbed the AFL and then created this. And so that's really the history of football. History of basketball, most people know James Naismith literally invented basketball in the YMCA in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is why the Basketball Hall of Fame's in Springfield, Massachusetts. How many of our viewers know why basketball players are called cagers? It's because basketball used to be played in a cage. And this is a photograph of them playing basketball in a cage. It was essentially a game dominated by white guys, although Harry Lue, this gentleman here, was the first African-American to play basketball at the collegiate or club level for the Pawtucketville Athletic Club in 1902. Eventually, the sport became integrated. These are the great University of San Francisco teams of the 1950s. That's Bill Russell in the middle. The Texas Western, it's now the University of Texas at El Paso, was the 1965 national champions. And that's important culturally because it was the first time in an NCAA championship game that all 5 starters were African Americans. We get to the NCAA, the Final Four. National Basketball League, professional basketball has the shorter history here, much shorter than the other sports. Well, other than soccer is less. We're having the 75th anniversary right now, but when the National Basketball League merged with the Association of American Basketball, and they created the National Basketball Association. That happened 75 years ago, and that gave rise to, the NBA. And basketball really changed with the emergence of Wilt Chamberlain in the late 50s, early 60s. Both an African-American was the dominant player, as was Bill Russell for the Boston Celtics, but also Chamberlain was 7 feet 1 or 2, but he was also coordinated, agile, and could move. He wasn't just a lumbering lummox. And you have the rise of basketball. And of course, LeBron James today. And you can win, just like we said a little bit earlier about W&J, you can win a lot of bar bets. I shouldn't have put this up there. I'm going to back that off, but I think most people have seen it already. Only one person has ever played in both an NBA championship game and won it, and an NFL championship game and won it. And you can win a lot of bar bets with this. And that person was Otto Graham, the quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, who also played basketball at Northwestern. But more importantly, played for the Rochester Royals in the National Basketball League the year they became the National Basketball Association. Hockey has always been a minor sport. I'm looking at the clock. I'm going a little quicker. Soccer is coming on, as we all know. Minor point, in the 1960s, a failed attempt to kind of just transplant soccer into America, much like the NFL now playing American football in London. In the summer of 65 and 66, some English Premier League Division I soccer teams came. Cleveland adopted the Stoke City team, and they became the Cleveland Stokers. And sometime in that sequence, I saw Pele play on the Brazilian national team against the Cleveland Stokers. And at that time, I didn't really know much about or understand soccer. Women's sports goes back to the 19th century, and it goes back to bicycle riding. As a matter of fact, bicycle riding was one of the things that revolutionized women in American sports, because prior to that, women wore dresses and you obviously cannot ride a bicycle side saddle like you can a horse. You had to bestride it, so you needed another kind of clothing, and that clothing was bloomers, which actually, in a person who wore them, was called a bloomer, as the clothing article was bloomers. And Susan B. Anthony herself said that bicycle riding was
I'll tell you
liberating.
what I think of bicycling. I think it has done more to emancipate women than any one thing in the world. I rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel. It gives her a feeling of self-reliance and independence the moment she takes her seat, and away she goes, the picture of untrammeled womanhood.
Well, that was Susan B. Anthony on how bicycling was actually liberating for women, but not all women agreed. A woman by the name of Sandra Berenson Abbott wrote, that's her, wrote Smith's Rules for Basketball. And if people might recall that women, they played basketball, only three players were allowed across the center line. Two had to stay back. There was rules about jumping. There was rules about how many times you had to dribble and pass before you could shoot. And it was all because there was a concern that sports for women would turn them into men, and that it was undignified and unladylike, etc. That's actually an old-time basketball image. And so it was women themselves, kind of, and then mountain days, as they were sometimes called. But there were other women who didn't entirely agree with that, who actually wanted to take sports seriously. And two of the most famous who changed American culture, well, the three of the most famous we're going to look at, was Helen Wills Moody, who was the first really great professional tennis player. And she played in a skirt, not a long dress, and she played to win. And she was considered unladylike for it. And Gertrude Ederle, who was the first woman to ever swim the English Channel. But probably the most famous woman athlete of the early and middle 20th century was Babe Didrikson Zarias, who was an Olympian and won gold medals in the Olympics, was a great track star, swimmer, and also a professional golfer. And she changed, in many ways, the world of women's sports because she competed at an extremely high level. There was also, during World War II, women's professional baseball. And this lady, whose name is Shirley Bukovich from Swissville, Pennsylvania, which is around Pittsburgh, played in the All-American Girls Professional League for the Chicago Colleens and the Rockford Peaches for 3 or 4 years. But it was not everyone agreed. And in fact, pop culture, a famous Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy movie, basically modeled after Babe Didrikson Zarias, where Spencer Tracy tried to tame and bring back in the woman athlete because it was unbecoming for a woman to beat men at their own game. The thing that changed everything, of course, was Title IX, which, and this shows you how recent it is. It isn't recent to Ben because it's before Ben was born, but to me it seems like it happened last week. Title IX in 1972 was an amendment to the 1965 Higher Education Act, which stated that no person shall be denied on the basis of sex, should be excluded or denied the benefits, and be subject to discrimination. That changed the world. There were some great female athletes before that, Althea Gibson, Wilma Rudolph. Actually, Billie Jean King did as much as anyone when she clobbered Bobby Riggs to show that women could compete. And of course, that changed the world. In my generation, when I think of well, they're obviously women now, the girls I went to high school and that with, there was just simply no avenue. It just didn't exist. There was no place for them to compete if they had any athletic instinct or interest. And that has completely changed. And as a woman at Chautauqua pointed out to me when I went over a version of this, it also has changed the definition of female beauty. And we could have a whole discussion with that. I'm certain that'll get some reaction. That prior to Title IX, femininity, and I believe the word the woman at Chautauqua used, which is much more tactful, I liked her word better than the one I had used, to be delicate. And now the whole notion of feminine attraction is that, I'm not going to say the whole notion, but is evolving towards that of the athlete. And so Title IX is one of the most important things that happened in our lifetime. This is actually Bernice Sandler, is the woman who drove Title IX's adoption. And of course, Title IX changed everything. Before it, 1 in every 27 girls played sports. Today, 1 in every 2.5 girls played sports. Before Title IX, only 7% of girls had access to athletics in high school. Today, it's 45%. Before Title IX, there were only 30,000 people involved in intercollegiate women's sports, and that would have primarily been swimming and golf. Now that number is north of 200,000. Well, that is really, and I'm looking at the clock, a quick and dirty history of American sports. What about those three big holidays? Well, one of the three, and like I said, I'm sure people have been to Derby parties. The Kentucky Derby, the Run for the Rose, is the greatest 2 minutes in sports. This is actually what Churchill Downs looked like in 1875, and that's what it looks like today. The Kentucky Derby was founded by Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., who, by the way, is the grandson of William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. He had seen the ups and downs. He had seen the Derby, the English Derby. They don't call it the English Derby. It's just called the Derby in England, at ups and downs, and decided to bring it to America and created the Kentucky Derby in 1875. The first horse to win the Kentucky Derby was Aristide, and he was ridden by an African-American jockey. As a matter of fact, 15 of the first 28 Kentucky Derbies were won by African-American jockeys before they were discriminated against and banned until late into the 20th century. Colonel Matt Winn made the Kentucky Derby a national phenomenon through the invention of pari-mutuel betting. And then the very first Kentucky Derby on the radio was 1925 and on television 1952. Diane Crump was the first woman to ride in a Kentucky Derby. You can argue about who is the greatest horse, Citation, the middle of the 20th century, but of course, Secretariat is probably the greatest horse. He still owns the record, 1973, so we're closing in on 50 years ago, and he still owns the record, 1 minute and 59.4 seconds, the fastest Derby ever run. Ben knows my fascination with all things 1968. I happened to be at the 1968 Kentucky Derby with another 100,000 fellow college students in various degrees of sobriety or not, when Dancer's Image won the Kentucky Derby and was the only horse in the history of it's absolutely apropos that it should have happened in 1968. The only horse in the history of the Derby to be disqualified for doping was Dancer's Image. Horse racing evolved into the Triple Crown, the lesser holidays, or the Preakness and the Belmont, but none of those compared to the Kentucky Derby. Baseball, the World Series, again, that Western Pennsylvania impact. This man is William C. Temple. He owned the Pittsburgh Professional Baseball Club in the late 19th century, and he created a thing called the Temple Cup, which from 1894 to 97 was awarded to the champion of the National League. I've really thought baseball dropped, no pun intended, the ball, because they could have had the oldest trophy, but they didn't do it. The very first World Series was in 1903 between the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Boston Americans. And this is a photo from that game at Exposition Park, which was in Allegheny, Pennsylvania. Allegheny, Pennsylvania was across the river. It's the north side of Pittsburgh. In those days, it was a separate town. The bridges didn't exist yet. Once the bridges were built, the city of Pittsburgh annexed it. The brochure from it, Cy Young was the great pitcher for the Boston Americans. Honus Wagner was the great star. This is the Pirates dugout. This is the Boston Americans, who unfortunately won the World Series 5-3. It was a 9-game thing. So the Boston Americans, they were not yet called the Red Sox, won the World Series. 1904 and 1994, what they have in common is it's the only 2 years since the beginning of the World Series that there was no World Series. Again, that Western Pennsylvania phenomena. The first baseball game ever broadcast on the radio was by Harold Arlen on KDKA. That's Graham McNamee, who was also part of KDKA, generally considered the first and arguably I don't know about the greatest, but it's certainly the first color commentator. Also, Tom Conway did a game of the Giants from the Polo Grounds by radio, but he was actually about 2 or 3 weeks after Harold Arlen at KDKA. First game on television was in the 1947 World Series between the Yankees and the Dodgers. I'm old enough to have remembered this. When I went to grade school in the 50s, you actually went home for lunch. You walked home for lunch. And in October, early October, the World Series would have been on television because it started at noon or 12:30. And I would watch the first 2 or 3 innings, and I thought the only 2 teams who were allowed to play in the World Series were the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Yankees, because every year that's who played in the World Series. Pittsburgh, once again, that Western Pennsylvania phenomena. The first World Series game played at night was on October 13th, 1971. The Pittsburgh Pirates and the Baltimore Orioles it's now torn down, at Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh. So it's just amazing to me when I did this, and I'm not slanting this because I'm from Eastern Ohio and Western Pennsylvania. These are, really interesting landmarks. Most famous moments in World Series history. I don't have time to go over all of it, but any Pittsburgh Pirate fan should be able to tell you what that moment is. That's the 1960 World Series when Bill Mazeroski hit the bottom of the ninth, the first walk-off homer. I think the only thing left standing of Forbes Field is some portion of that brick wall, which is there. And of course, as a longtime Cleveland Indians fan, I always say being a Cleveland Indians fan is defined by the fact the greatest catch in the history of baseball, your guy hit the ball. That's Willie Mays making the catch in 1954. Back to that thing of the NFL. Well, the Canton Bulldogs were the champions. Believe it or not, sports fans and kids, there was life before the Super Bowl, and there were champions. The 1920 Canton Bulldogs, the 1931 Green Bay Packers, the 1941 Chicago Bears, the monsters of the Midway, the 1950 Cleveland Browns, those 1958 Baltimore Colts, and the last team to win the National Football League championship before the Super Bowl, the 1965 Green Bay Packers. But of course, and this is Marion Motley, I should have put that up earlier, who played for, as I pointed out earlier, those 1950 Cleveland Browns, and Johnny Unitas, who was the quarterback of those Baltimore Colts. But in 1967, because of the merger that had been effected between the NFL and the AFL, the Buffalo Bills almost played in the first Super Bowl, but in true Bills fashion, they lost to the Kansas City Chiefs. The Packers beat the Cowboys, and you have the first World Championship game, which they downplayed Super Bowl because initially Pete Rozelle signed it kind of stupid, and there was a kid's toy of that era called a Super Ball, which was a little rubber ball that had, I don't know, it was a little rubber ball on steroids, because if you bounced it, it would go like 15 feet in the air. And he thought people would get confused between Super Bowl and Super Bowl, but actually Pete Rozelle figured out fairly quickly that Super Bowl was a powerful marketing tool. And you got the Green Bay Packers and the Kansas City Chiefs. The Super Bowl, I was looking for great moments in the Super Bowl, and millennials with their classic myopia, most of the list had anything from the last 5 to 10 years. I'm going to argue that the greatest moment in Super Bowl history was in Super Bowl III, when Western Pennsylvania, Beaver Falls' own Joe Namath, called it and then delivered it when the Jets beat the Baltimore Colts in the first time in Franco Harris, et cetera, and the great Steeler teams of the 70s. People watch the Super Bowl because it's been a holiday, and there's many people who will tell you more about the ads than the game itself. And these are a couple of quick samples of the great ads. This is the famous Apple anti-Macintosh ad. Not anti, they were anti-Big Brother promoting the Macintosh. The Schwab brokerage, the little kid who could talk like an adult, Mean Joe Green, the Budweiser frogs, the showdown between Bird and Johnson, and Betty White doing her dirty old lady imitation, salaciously selling Snickers bars. And then, of course, Super Bowl parties. So anyways, that was a sprint through the history of American sports and American sporting holidays. We'll be picking up on other parts of this next month on turkeys and Halloween. And I'm just going to stop. I want to thank everyone for listening to this. And I'm going to stop the share and see if Ben has any questions or if we have any questions from the audience.
So, Dr. Roth, I want to thank you. That in and of itself is a sport, getting through all of that in that amount of time. And I think every time we do one of these, we find out how many more threads are out there that can be future programs or future discussions and ways to look at this from a different angle. Because looking at the next one, we talk about holidays and Thanksgiving, being one of them. I can't help but inextricably link that to back to sports and think about coming around the electric hearth to watch football games. Thanksgiving's typically the Macy's Day Parade, the dog show, and then football games, and we see that continue to be added. The fact that I remember growing up, it was two games. We had one in the afternoon and then one later in the afternoon. Now there are three. There's one
I can do you
early.
one better. I can remember growing up, and the only game there was only one. Whoops! How about it? Sorry, Ben. There we go.
You're still there.
Oh, okay. I was trying to close the thing. Originally, there was only one, and it was the Green Bay Packers played the Detroit Lions, and it was always in Detroit. And I think
Right.
Detroit still gets the first game, is always Detroit.
They do, and the Dallas Cowboys now, America's team, is generally the second game, and it's been rotating who gets the third. But I think that comes back to again how we start laying on all of these layers of the sports, because it does become the game itself. When these games are happening, then what we're watching around these games. And I think that's back to the commercials. But I think with the Super Bowl too, think about the draws and the TV power of how many folks tune in just for the halftime show. When it's announced the halftime entertainment, I can't help but wonder, what The Weeknd as a musical artist has in common with football, other than appearing at the same time on our TVs, one time a year, or one particular year that happens.
I think about the comment that Bishop Brock and Reverend Downey made to me, and somehow it connects with what you're saying about Thanksgiving Day. And this is literally, I think, the last 10 years, maybe the last 5 years, this notion that on Christmas Day, and one of the hollow, no pun intended, benchmarks used to be, you didn't do anything, there's nothing on Christmas Day. And some years ago, I don't remember when, there was an NFL playoff game, but this may be as long ago as the 70s, on Christmas Eve, and that was thought to be pushing it. And it went into, it was supposed to end. Somebody had some residual knowledge of theological history. It was supposed to end before dusk. It was in the afternoon, but the game went into overtime and it ran late. And that was considered, that was actually minor controversy that they were on what was, important. And now the NBA plays, I think, 4 or 5 games on Christmas Day, and it's a big deal. And so I don't know where to go with that right now, other than to make the observation, but it also kind of fits, Reverend Bishop Brock and Reverend Downey's observation. I mean, there's something going on about the sports. But in any event, I don't think that was stretching it to involve sports as part of the holiday series, because I mean, the Kentucky Derby, people will go next May. I can think you go to any club, bar, group in Erie, there'll be a Derby party. And Super Bowl parties in February are just, I'm not so sure anybody does World Series parties unless their team happens to be involved. And we get back to that, I'd call it almost a marketing phenomena, that baseball cannot tell you that on November, well, now it's into November for God's sake, but that on November 3rd, the championship game will be played. The NBA and hockey also have the same problem. The NCAA Final Four always ends on a Monday, and it's announced in advance. But that date, again, unless your team's involved, has not had the same kind of national clout.
Well, I can't help but think, one, to make the case of sports being holidays in their ability to bring us together in a way that seems to be beyond the thing itself. And I see that with one, I'm not an avid horse race watcher, but I watch the Derby. It's a thing, and I will stand, when we can safely do this, shoulder to shoulder with other people watching it, who I assume are probably, more in line with me than somebody else that, might follow horse racing on a week-to-week basis, just because it's happening and it brings us together. There's a sense of communion in that, which I think is brings us back to the religious experience in a way But I think that one of the challenges baseball has, and I can't help but think of a conversation that we had at the JES with Frank Garland, who's written outstanding biographies on a couple of Pittsburgh Pirate greats. Archie Vaughn being one of them, and Willie Stargell being another. And we talked about, is baseball still America's sport? And what we had to wrestle with is that it may not necessarily be a sport that is designed to be watched on television. And I, for one, agree with that. I love going to baseball games in person. I'll watch them on TV, but not with the same enthusiasm. And also, you said the unknown, and that can be scary. If we have to watch, are you telling me we have to watch 4 games or 5 or 6 or 7? And when do we tune in to know it's good? You know, that it's actually getting to be a good series versus Super Bowl's 1 game. It's 60 minutes of play, and we know that there's going to be an outcome. And now with the rules around the sports, we know it's not going to be a tie. Something will happen to determine the winner of that game. And I think that the idea that it's finite and that we can plug in for a certain amount of time, be entertained, watch it, and move on, I think might be more appealing to today's consumer nature of give me the thing and I want to move to the next. Another conversation for another day, but another fantastic presentation here, Dr. Roth.
Yeah, football, I know we're running out of time. Those are all great observations. I think football, and this is really slightly off the holiday topic, because what I was trying for here and what need to make me draw it a little tighter in any next time I do this, is it brings people together in a way in which they can share their enthusiasm for a thing and do it in a kind of communal way. I mean, Browns and Steelers fans, for example, will go at one another, but they do it. Not all. I know there's some who take it maybe just a little too seriously, but they do it in a way that they can actually then survive with one another after the fact. Now, I know a couple of people who that a little bit of a stretch, or like that high school rivalry I talked about. There is a kind of, that rivalry has a real intensity to it, but it's so far, knock on wood, rarely been marred with violence. Now, they do play it at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon and have played it on Saturday afternoons for 100 years. So I can't tell you what happened a long time ago. And those two schools, well, they both made the state playoffs. Neither of them are what they once were. Probably of the two that's close to being as good as they once were, I'd have to say it to give the devil their due is probably Massillon. But there's a certain bonding that occurs. The competition's fierce, and there are people who go over the edge, but for the most part, I'm not going to even say it's good natured. The last comment on football, and this would be a different thing. This would be an entire episode or entire program that's only tangentially connected to the holidays. It would, the holiday series would be football's the ultimate TV sport. It's played on a rectangular plane. Television screens are rectangular. The action stops and starts. And then I remember some wise guy made the comment, and theologically, you get your own Christians and Lions. The offense are your Christians, you get to cheer for them, and then you get to flip your personality around and let your evil side come out and cheer for your Lions to devour the other side's whatever. Anyways, I've enjoyed it, Ben. We probably are abusing our viewers' patience.
Well, and I think certainly number one, plenty of discussion to come back to, and you're going to see us again on November 18th. And I think, you've just queued up multiple discussions outside of the holiday series, again, and now I want to think about the commercialism of sports and taking a look at that, how sports are influencing sports, because you gave me the idea that now football, watching it on TV, it's sort of the greatest 2 minutes over 3 hours of watching a play of intensity. You stop. Watching a play of intensity, you stop. It's not this game of finesse that perhaps baseball's likened to, but plenty more to unpack with the holiday series. But Dr. Andrew Roth, scholar in residence at the Jefferson Educational Society and host of the American Tapestry Project on WQLN Public Media, with episodes available on the NPR One app. Thank you for this insightful discussion, fun discussion. An excuse for me to wear a hat during programming. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us here today.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. You're welcome.
And of course, a big thanks to all of you watching along at home, tuning in real time, or watching this program, streaming it on demand. The programs like this, the discussions, the exchange of information and ideas would not be possible without you. We're rooting for you. We hope you're rooting for us. And of course, for more information about upcoming JES digital programs like that one on November 18th coming up and another program in December, do visit our website, jeserie.org, where you'll also find videos of other past presentations available to stream on demand and publications, including reports, essays, and timely writings, as well as that book note series from Dr. Roth. And of course, more information about the other things your Jefferson Educational Society is doing. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.